The other thing I want to discuss about darts, shaped darts, is you can also move a dart excess into a seam. So you can transfer that dart into a style. A seam is basically a style line. So in this particular example, you would draft your bodice. You would decide where your style line wants to go. It must bisect the dart excess so that we can pivot that excess into the seam. So we would close out the dart and then blend our dart excess. So I'm going to demonstrate this particular example, the shaped dart or dart lost into a seam. So then we'll have completed the Designing with Darts Chapter 5 series. So the first step is always going to be establish your grain line. That's your Bible, that's your go home. And then we'll hook up our bodice. So now we want to, this is your bodice block, we want to decide our style line. So, I just want to make it pretty. I want it to go from here to here. It's got to bisect my dart apex in order to work effectively. I'm going to take my shape tool and I want it to be so a straight line. It's got to be perpendicular to that dart first. And then it's going to come down and be nice and shaped down here. So I'm going to close out this waist dart and pivot it into this shaped tool. So I'm going to trim out my dart excess. And then I can slash on this new style line. And remember, when I'm slashing, I'm going to back off about 1/8 of an inch from that pivot point. So this is going to be hooked onto my center front grain. Close my waist dart. But now I want to make this all one piece. So this basically, now I would like this to become a seam, a stylized seam. So I'm going to trim on this section here. Basically, we're converting this into two pieces, kind of like a modified princess pen. So I now have two pieces to draft. I'm going to have a top bodice and a bottom bodice. Both of them will need a grain line. Both of them will need seam allowance. I'm going to secure this. Secure this. We'll notch and blend our little hearts out. So, first things first, we want to establish our grain so we don't get lost. Second thing is we're going to blend. Third thing will be adding notches so we know where to join these. The first thing I want to transfer is my grain line. So my grain comes over from my center front. This is going to be, I want this piece to be cut on the fold. And I want this piece to be cut on the fold. But this is not a whole lot of area to give you. You know, these grain lines on a pattern piece are to guide you to align with the grain line of the fabric. So it's a good idea. Your grain line just runs parallel to your center front. So you can simply use your ruler to move your grain line over. It's going to run parallel. So now I can copy this. I have a grain line on my pattern piece. That will be easier to follow. You want your grain line to be in the biggest part of the pattern piece so that it's easier to follow. Then a couple of things here. I want to make sure, look at that ugly pointy issue. That's going to be an issue in sewing. So I can blend this out using my curve tool so it'll have a nice smoother sew. Same thing here. I want to make sure this is nice and blended. And you want to have some sewing notches to ensure that these pieces connect with one another. So when this is opened up on the fold, you will have a center front notch. You'll have a center front notch at the bottom hem. But that's not enough to make sure that these pieces connect with each other properly. So I'm going to make sure that I add a control notch here, about 2 inches down from the top on each piece, so that these are called join notches. And I'm putting them on the draft right now. You will, of course, transfer these into the seam allowance, but they're to help us connect, and we're going to talk about those in more detail. Same thing here from the front. I want to make sure that these are lining up in the sewing process. So about 2 inches in, I want to make sure I have a control notch in here, just so that when I'm hooking the pieces back up, walking them together, they have something to align. Then when I go to add my seam allowance, this is a seam, so it's going to get what's a 1/2 inch. A 1/2 inch seam allowance, a 1/2 inch on the armhole, a 1/2 inch on the side seam, 1 inch for the hem. This is a seam, so this is going to get a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That was our shoulder, a 1/2 inch seam allowance, 1/4 inch on the neckline, and your center fronts are cut on the fold.